Did you ever look at something and know it's broken, but you can't see what's wrong? Sophia Chen stood in the dim electrical room on the second floor of Meridian Tech's downtown Chicago building. It was 5 in the morning hours, before anyone else would arrive. She held a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, staring at the man on his knees in front of the HVAC system. Marcus Reed didn't look up. He was adjusting something deep inside the machinery, his movements precise and deliberate. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with his name embroidered on the chest, in simple block letters. 5 years he'd been working here, and Sophia had never spoken to him directly until today. She had called him up from maintenance, not with an email or a message, but by walking down 2 flights of stairs herself. That's what desperation did to you. It made you willing to ask questions in places where people like Sophia Chen didn't usually ask them. Marcus finally glanced up. His eyes were sharp gray, the kind of eyes that noticed things others didn't. "Is this going to smell like dust for the rest of the day?" Sophia asked. It was a test. She wasn't really concerned about the dust. "No," Marcus said. His voice was low, steady. 20 minutes. He said it like someone who knew exactly how long things took. Not an estimate, not a hope, a fact. Sophia had been surrounded by people her entire career who spoke in estimations and probabilities. This was different. "Good," she said. "I have a meeting at 3. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, but as she did, something shifted in her mind. That name on his uniform, Marcus Reed, it meant something. She'd heard it before years ago, in the context of brilliant young engineers who were going to revolutionize the company's future. What had happened to him? She would spend the next 6 hours finding out, and it would change everything. Meridian Tech was dying, not visibly, not yet. But Sophia could feel it, the way a doctor feels, a patient's pulse weakening. The company her father had built, the company she'd taken over 18 months ago, was about to lose its biggest contract in history. $500 million. That was the size of the Iron Gate project. It was meant to be her legacy, the thing that proved she wasn't just riding her father's coattails. Instead, it was becoming her funeral. The client had contracted Meridian Tech to build a smart building system for 200 structures across the Great Lakes region. Smart buildings that would manage their own energy, that would breathe and adapt and optimize themselves. It was revolutionary. It was supposed to be perfect. It wasn't perfect. It was hemorrhaging money. The system was consuming 40% more energy than projected. 40%. That wasn't a rounding error. That was a catastrophe with a deadline attached. In 2 weeks, the client's executives would review the performance data. If they saw the same numbers Sophia was seeing, they would invoke the termination clause. $500 million gone. $50 million in penalties on top of that. And the reputational damage, the kind that would follow Meridian Tech for years. The kind that would make every future client wonder if this company actually knew what it was doing. A consulting firm had been brought in 6 weeks ago. 4 engineers, a project lead, with 22 years of experience and fees that reflected their confidence. They'd reviewed the system from every angle. They'd rerun projections. They'd interviewed the partner firm's technical team. They'd produced 3 separate reports that restated the problem in increasingly elaborate language without actually solving anything. The problem was simple enough to describe the buildings, weren't performing as the algorithm predicted they would. But the solution, nobody had found it yet. Sophia had been staring at the schematics for so long that the lines didn't make sense anymore. She'd memorized every section, every connection, every theoretical expectation, and still the thing that was wrong inside them stayed invisible to her. It was like the way a word becomes unreadable when you've stared at it past the point where it carries meaning. That was when she found the old file on her desk, a PowerPoint presentation from a decade ago. The title, Smart Building Systems, A Revolutionary Approach. The author, Marcus Reed. She'd called HR. She'd asked the obvious questions. Yes, Marcus Reed had worked here. No, he didn't anymore. He'd left 10 years ago. No drama, just a resignation letter and an explanation about family circumstances. Currently, he worked in maintenance. Building maintenance. Second floor. The ghost. That was what people called him. Sophia had heard the nickname a few times at the office. The man who fixed things you didn't know were broken. The man who disappeared into the building and made everything run smoothly and never asked for recognition or thanks. That ghost was about to save her company whether he wanted to or not. She'd walked down to find him, not because she had a plan, but because intuition had stopped being a luxury. Some people had that feeling when something was exactly right. Sophia had it when she stood in front of Marcus Reed that morning. "I know who you are," she'd said, after he'd told her about the 20 minutes until the dust settled. "You worked here before." "I did." "Why did you leave Marcus?" Had been quiet for a moment. "Then my son, he got sick. He needed me home. Is he okay now?" "Yes. 14 years in remission." That was all he said. Sophia could have asked more questions, but she understood instinctively that pushing would be wrong. This man didn't trade in explanations or justifications. He dealt in facts and action, and the kind of presence that suggested he'd made peace with every hard choice he'd ever made. "Have you looked at the Meridian Smart Building System?" she'd asked. "Every day." "I maintain it. It's wrong." Wrong how it's missing 47 things Marcus had said. But the biggest one is the same. The system doesn't know that buildings breathe. It doesn't know that buildings have personalities. It treats them like machines, like everything is identical, like inputs produce the same outputs everywhere. But that's not true. Every building is different. Every building is alive in its own way. The system doesn't account for that, and when it doesn't account for it, it breaks. Sophia had stood there, and something inside her had clicked into place. This was it. This was the piece she'd been missing. Not more theory, not more consulting reports written by people who'd never spent a day inside an actual building. She needed someone who understood buildings the way Marcus seemed to understand them. "Can you fix it?" she'd asked. "Yes." "Do you want to try?" Marcus had looked at his watch. "I need to pick up my son from school at 3:30. We'll be done before then." She wasn't asking. She was informing him of how this would work. She'd given him everything, all the system documentation, all the technical specifications, all the architectural data for every building in the project. She'd locked him in the conference room on the 38th floor with a folder an inch thick and a deadline of 1 day. He'd needed only 5 hours. Ethan could read his father's mood the way some people could read the weather. The slight change in how Marcus held his shoulders, the particular way he gripped the steering wheel. Today, something was different. "Did something good happen?" Ethan asked as he buckled into the truck. He was 14 now, tall enough that Marcus sometimes forgot to think of him as a kid. The baseball cap that had been his constant companion through chemotherapy was gone now, but the habits remained. Ethan still noticed things. He still watched people's faces. Marcus pulled out of the school parking lot before answering. I met someone today. Someone who needs help with a project. With maintenance, no. With engineering. The kind of work I used to do. Ethan turned to look at his father. There was a question forming behind his eyes. The question was, does this mean things are going to change? Will you do it? Ethan asked instead. I don't know, Marcus said. And he meant it. He didn't know. The person is the CEO. She's important. The project is important. It would mean late nights, maybe a few weeks. Would I be okay? Ethan asked. That was his way. Not asking if his father would be okay abandoning him, but whether his father thought Ethan could handle his attention being divided. The boy had learned a long time ago that you didn't fall apart just because things got harder. Yes, I'd still pick you up every day. You'd just spend some evenings with Huyen. Huyen was their neighbor, a woman with 3 kids of her own, who'd become their lifeline during the worst years. She'd sat with Marcus in waiting rooms. She'd brought meals when he couldn't cook. She'd taught Ethan that adults sometimes needed each other just to survive. Will you do it? Ethan asked again. Marcus glanced at his son through the rearview mirror. The past 6 years had aged Ethan in some ways, and kept him impossibly young in others. The way he sat, the directness of his gaze, the complete absence of resentment, these were the things of a child who'd learned to treasure stability above almost everything else. I think I want to, Marcus said carefully, but I don't want to break what we have. You won't break it, Ethan said. Not if you come back every night. Not if you're still my dad. Marcus felt something catch in his chest. When had his son become so wise? Yeah, Marcus said. Yeah, I'll do it. Ethan smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made everything else fall away. It was the smile of a kid who'd been given permission to let his father be more than just a father. More than just the person who showed up and paid attention and kept him alive. He was being given permission to let his father be himself again. Marcus worked that night until 2 in the morning. He sat at his kitchen table with the folder in front of him, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, his hands moving across the pages in the way hands move when the mind behind them is decades into a problem. He'd forgotten what this felt like, the particular kind of focus that came when you were building something, not fixing something, not maintaining something, but actually building, constructing, creating. The errors in the system jumped out at him almost immediately once he let himself really look. They were the kind of errors that only made sense if you'd spent years understanding how buildings actually functioned. You could read about it in theory, sure, but you had to hear it. You had to hear the particular groan of an HVAC system struggling. You had to listen to the pressure changes in the pipes. You had to feel the way a building shifted and breathed and adapted. The algorithm treated buildings like mathematical equations. Sophia's system treated them like they were all identical. But they weren't. Each one was old or new. Each one had been built with different materials. Each one had tenants that created heat moisture, different patterns of use. When you exceeded the primary grid's capacity by more than 34%, it didn't degrade gracefully. It didn't fail in phases. It collapsed. Complete system failure. The solution wasn't to strengthen the main branch. It was to teach the system to grow in multiple directions. Independent load balancing, lateral distribution instead of hierarchical. Let secondary demand spread horizontally instead of cascading upward. Marcus wrote it all down. 45 pages of analysis and solution and implementation strategy. Not fancy language, not theoretical frameworks. Just the pure, simple truth of what was broken and how to fix it. He had sheets of paper spread across the kitchen table when Ethan came down the next morning before school. His son looked at the pages at his father's handwriting, filling every margin at the intensity that was radiating off him. "Is it good?" Ethan asked. "I think so," Marcus said. "We'll see." Sophia had called him at 8 o'clock in the morning. The board meeting was at 3. She wanted him to present. Marcus had stared at the phone for a long moment. Presenting meant being in a room full of executives who would judge him. It meant standing in front of people who'd never heard his name, who wouldn't know that he'd built systems that were still running, still working, still handling power grids across the entire Midwest. It meant making himself visible. He'd been invisible for so long, and he'd become comfortable with it. But Ethan's words echoed in his mind. Not the direct permission, but the implication behind it. "You can be more than this." "I'll be there," Marcus said. The boardroom on the 38th floor was exactly what Marcus had expected. Glass windows that looked out over the city. A long table with 14 people sitting around it. Power in every gesture, in the way they held themselves, in the assumption that they belonged in this space, in a way that maintenance workers simply did not. Sophia sat at the head of the table. Richard Torres, the chief operating officer, sat to her right, and he was already radiating displeasure about this meeting. He didn't like surprises. He didn't like his authority being circumvented. And apparently Sophia had circumvented his authority significantly. "Thank you all for being here," Sophia said. "I want to introduce someone to you. This is Marcus Reed. He worked for Meridian Tech in senior engineering. He left 6 years ago to care for his son who was ill. His son is healthy now, and Marcus has found the solution to the Iron Gate problem." The room went still. One person actually laughed a little, the kind of laugh people make when they think they're the only one in on a joke. Torres leaned forward. "I'm not sure I understand what's happening here, Sophia. This isn't procedure. This isn't how we handle external consultants." "Marcus isn't an external consultant," Sophia said. "He's internal. He's been internal the entire time, apparently noticing things our external consultants missed." "This is highly irregular," Torres said. His voice had taken on an edge. "The consulting firm is being paid to solve this problem. We can't simply bring in a maintenance worker and—" "Sit down, Richard," Sophia said. Her voice didn't change. It didn't get louder or more aggressive. But there was something underneath it. Something that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Marcus walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. A set of markers sat on the tray. He picked up the black one and uncapped it. For a moment, he stood facing the blank surface, and something shifted inside him. This was the first time in 6 years that he'd been allowed to do this, to think out loud, to share what he saw. He began to draw. The original algorithm appeared in lines and boxes and connections. He traced the foundational assumptions that the consulting firm had built everything on, and then he showed where those assumptions broke down. The system assumes buildings equilibrate, he said. His voice was steady, measured. Buildings don't equilibrate. They breathe, they shift, they age. The system was built for a theoretical building that doesn't exist. Every actual building is different. He drew the failure points, 47 of them. He didn't list them all. That would have been pedantic and boring. Instead, he showed the pattern. The way that exceeding capacity on the primary grid didn't cause degradation. It caused collapse. When demand spikes, Marcus continued, the subsidiary networks don't smoothly absorb it. They fail. The entire system fails. That's why the energy consumption is up 40%. The system is constantly failing and recovering, failing and recovering. It's like a person who can't breathe properly. They use 4 times the energy to do the same work. He drew the solution. 3 diagrams, 1 for each phase of implementation. Lateral load distribution, independent secondary grids, a system that could adapt instead of one that only knew how to function in theory. With these changes, Marcus said your performance will be 3 to 4% above projection. Not below. Above. The system will actually work the way you told the client it would work. He set down the marker. The room was silent in a way that suggested people were processing something they hadn't expected to understand. James Whitmore, the board chairman, was staring at the diagrams with an intensity that suggested he saw exactly what Marcus had drawn. The man was in his 70s, had spent decades in the energy business before moving to the board. He understood the language of systems and failures and real-world implementation. Whitmore looked at Marcus directly. If we implement these changes, he said, how long until the system is operational? 10 days, Marcus said, if I have access and support. And you know this because I've maintained this building for 5 years. I know how it breathes. I know what it needs. Whitmore picked up a copy of Marcus's report. He was reading carefully, the way someone reads when they're looking for lies. He read the first page, then the second. Then he flipped to the middle section where Marcus had laid out each problem and its corresponding solution. This is good work, Whitmore said finally. This is real work. Not theoretical. Real. He looked at Torres. I'm satisfied. We move forward with these recommendations. Torres stood up. This is a mistake. You're dismissing a professional consulting firm based on the opinions of a building maintenance worker. You're opening the company up to liability if this fails. If it fails, Whitmore said, it fails. But it won't fail. This man knows what he's talking about. I'm opposing this officially, Torres said. I'm documenting my opposition. Documented, Whitmore said. He turned back to Marcus. When can you start? Tonight, Marcus said. Torres stood there for a moment longer. Then he said something that would echo through the company for months afterward. I resign. Effective immediately. He left the room. Nobody stopped him. Nobody called him back. The door closed quietly, and everyone understood that they'd just watched something significant happen. Not just a project being approved, but a moment of reckoning. The Iron Gate system lived in the cloud, but it was rooted in physical infrastructure. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks in a state of focused intensity that Sophia recognized and protected. She made sure his work was undisturbed. She made sure people understood not to ask him questions unless they were essential. She made sure he had everything he needed, and she worked alongside him, learning the system as he modified it, understanding his logic, asking questions that helped him explain his thinking more clearly. Ethan adapted to his father working late. Huyen picked him up from school and fed him dinner. Marcus was home by 11, would check on his sleeping son, would collapse into bed, would wake at 5 the next morning to repeat the process. On the 5th day, Marcus discovered that the problem was bigger than just software. The main pump on the 32nd floor was failing. It had been failing slowly, which meant the system had been compensating, using more energy to pump less water, which fed right back into the calculation errors. "We need to replace it," Marcus told Sophia. "How long?" she asked. 2 days if we work round the clock." Sophia called James Whitmore. "We need a new water pump for the 32nd floor. Can you authorize emergency procurement?" Within an hour, the pump was being delivered. By day 10, Marcus had completed every change. He sent a report to Whitmore. "All systems operational. Performance data shows energy consumption at 3.8% above projection. This is acceptable and will improve as the buildings age less severely than the original simulation predicted." He was done. The crisis was resolved. Ethan noticed the moment Marcus walked through the apartment door. His father looked like someone who'd been holding his breath underwater and had finally broken the surface. "Did it work?" Ethan asked. "Yeah," Marcus said. "It worked." He collapsed on the couch and Ethan sat beside him. They didn't talk. They just existed in the same space the way they had through all the hard years, the way they would through all the years to come. "So what happens now?" Ethan asked after a while. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "I guess I go back to maintenance. Do you want to?" Marcus thought about it. The past 2 weeks had reminded him what it felt like to use his mind at full capacity, what it felt like to solve actual problems, what it felt like to matter in a way that stretched beyond keeping the building's systems running. "No," he said. "No, I don't want to go back to maintenance, but I don't know if anyone's going to offer me anything else." The offer came the next morning. Sophia had requested Marcus's presence in the 38th floor conference room at 8 o'clock. He'd thought he would be receiving thanks, maybe a bonus. Instead, there was a contract on the table. "Vice Director of Technology," Sophia said. "The same title you had before, but better this time." Marcus picked up the contract. The salary was substantial. The benefits were comprehensive. But the most important thing was in the working conditions section: hours 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. weekdays, flexible schedule. Fridays work from home. 4 weeks paid leave annually. Full board membership. "You're going to need someone who understands how buildings actually work," Sophia said. "Not someone who understands theory. Someone who knows the difference between what we think should happen and what actually happens. Someone who's willing to be in the room and not just theorize about the room from a distance. I think you're that person." Marcus tried to find words and couldn't. He'd thought this chapter of his life was over. He'd made peace with being invisible, and now he was being asked to be visible again. "What about the schedule?" he asked. "The 3:30 thing, it's in the contract," Sophia said. "Non-negotiable. I don't want to work with someone whose family is falling apart because of a job. I've seen that happen. It doesn't produce good work. It produces broken people who make broken decisions." Marcus signed the contract in Sophia's presence, and she signed it as well. Witnesses weren't required, but they both knew they wanted one anyway. They wanted this to be real in a way that went beyond legal documentation. When he told Ethan that evening, His son's reaction wasn't surprise or excitement. It was relief. "I'm really glad," Ethan said simply. "I know this job made you happy." A year passed. Marcus's office on the 38th floor became a place where the company's best engineers wanted to work. He didn't hire the smartest people. He hired people who understood the difference between elegant theory and effective practice. He built systems that worked not because they were perfect, but because they were honest about the buildings they served. The Iron Gate project expanded. 200 buildings became 400. The contract value doubled. Meridian Tech's reputation shifted from company that almost failed to company that truly understands how buildings work. Ethan turned 15. He played basketball with a ferocity that suggested he was done being careful. He had a girlfriend he didn't talk about much. He spent some afternoons with Marcus at the office watching his father work, absorbing the knowledge that seemed to come so naturally to him. James Whitmore retired as board chairman and recommended Sophia for the position. She accepted on the condition that Marcus would be promoted to vice president of technology. The board agreed without hesitation. One evening, Marcus sat in his office watching the city lights come on as the sun set. The sky was turning purple and gold, the kind of beautiful that only happened for a few minutes before disappearing completely. Ethan would be waiting downstairs in the lobby. They had plans to get dinner, to see a basketball game, to do the normal things that people did when they had the freedom to do them. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia hiring Jennifer Martinez. She was engineering before she left to care for her father. Thought she might like the second chance we got. Marcus smiled. The company was changing, not dramatically but fundamentally. It was becoming a place where people understood that life happened alongside work, not separate from it. He gathered his things and headed for the elevator. As he descended, he thought about the man he'd been 6 years ago, invisible on the second floor fixing systems nobody knew were broken, and the man he was now visible in a way that mattered, leading teams, making decisions, proving that you didn't have to choose between being a father and being who you were meant to be. Ethan was waiting in the lobby, his basketball tucked under one arm. He grinned when he saw his father. No words were needed. They walked out into the Chicago evening together. Two people who'd learned that the things worth keeping were worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let someone be exactly who they were. A year later, Marcus stood in front of a classroom of engineering students at Northwestern University. Sophia had pulled strings to make this happen, to get him in front of young people who thought engineering was only about theory. "Buildings are alive," Marcus told them. Not metaphorically, literally alive. They have systems that respond and adapt. They have weaknesses and strengths. They have personalities. If you treat them like math problems, you'll always fail. But if you spend time listening to them, really listening, you'll understand something that no textbook can teach you. Ethan sat in the back row taking notes. His father noticed, and something settled in his chest. The cycle was turning. Knowledge was being passed. The things that mattered were being preserved. That night, Marcus and Ethan drove home in comfortable silence. The city lights streamed past. Marcus thought about the path that had brought him here, the choices that had seemed so hard at the time, and now seemed like the only choices that ever made sense. "I'm proud of you," Ethan said out of nowhere. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "For what?" "For being willing to be seen," Ethan said. "For not staying invisible just because it was easier." Marcus reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. He didn't have words for what that meant. He didn't need them. What mattered was that they were here together exactly as they'd both chosen to be.